Hello, I am Jen Martinez, pronouns they, them. I'm a full-time counselor and a doctoral intern at the counseling center.
Hi, I'm Ishita Arora, pronouns she, her, hers. I am a doctoral extern at the Counseling Center.
And we'll be doing this first installment of the Women of Color Coping Circle. This is a series of webinars that we'll be doing, and each one has a focus on a different topic. So today's topic is going to be on virus racialization, inequity, and oppression. So just to orient you to the scope of this webinar, we really wanted to provide a space for folks to have an opportunity to reflect on your experiences and to also receive resources. But we do want to note that this is not intended as a substitute for therapy. But if you are interested in receiving services or would like help around a mental health concern, feel free to reach us at the counseling center. Our phone number is right on the screen. And if you leave a message, you can consult with one of our staff psychologists. And then if you're really experiencing significant psychological distress or have a fear that you may put yourself or others at risk of physical harm, please either call 911. If you're on campus, call the campus police or go to the nearest emergency room. So to just give you an overview of what we'll be talking about today, we're going to start with a poem just to set the tone for today's topic. We'll talk a little bit about the viruses and scapegoating and the history of ways that race and racism has played a part in that. We'll talk about specific racism and xenophobia that's been happening during COVID. Certainly not when they started, but have been amplified. And then we also want to kind of have moments where we're going to reflect and give a prompt for things for you to be reflecting on, either through journaling with some sort of guided meditation, or as conversation prompts with maybe a group or with friends that you would want to be discussing this with. We'll also talk about skills and resources specifically for coping. Um, and then we'll end with an affirmation for the webinar and also provide some additional resources.
So, as Jen said, we would start this particular webinar with a poem. And this poem is specifically for the Women of Color Coping Circle. We have been running this coping circle first in person and then as the form of webinar for the academic year 2019 and 2020. And we all felt that this poem really reflected the need for this kind of coping circle and space for the women of color. So Jasmine Kaur writes this poem called Safe Space, and they say, to be surrounded by women of color is to heal, which isn't to say that it's their job to be a balm, but that this whole earth is a sharpened blade, and I'm grateful to have found the only place where I feel safe enough to catch my breath and let the wounds rest.
Thank you, Ishta. And so we wanted to share this poem because I think it really kind of encapsulates the power of being in community with other women of color and really wanting to set that um, as a an intention of the space we want to be creating and recognizing the unique experiences. So we want to just kind of do a quick overview just to give folks an idea and a context of ways that what's happening right now or what's been happening has been um, nothing new in terms of scapegoating viruses and disease to communities that are often othered in different contexts. So um, some early literature about the Black Death or the bubonic plague really was focused on. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and it was also called the Oriental Plague, and so it was really um, kind of as people were trying to understand what the virus was doing and how it contracted, what they were noticing was that, at least in Europe at the time, um, that there were Jewish folks who were not having the same rates of contraction and death related to the plague, and so there was a lot of views that this meant that they were the ones perpetuating or kind of weaponizing um, a virus, which I think is pretty similar to what is some of the conspiracy theories going on around Chinese folks um, and the Chinese government. Um, and then even coming into the U.S., that with cholera outbreaks in New York, there was a lot of scapegoating on Irish Catholics. With smallpox in San Francisco, um, there was a belief that Chinese Americans were actually the ones who were carrying the disease, and that they were required to get forced vaccinations. And it also kind of prompted the first race-based immigration policy with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then within the last couple decades, we've also been seeing this um, occur in the US with SARS in 2003. There was a lot of discrimination against Chinese Americans and Chinese travelers. And then with the Ebola in 2014, there's a lot of discrimination against West Africans, and conspiracy is that Obama was weaponizing viruses, and some people called it Ebola. Um, and as a result of all of these of this history, the World Health Organization created guidelines for naming viruses, and specifically stated that the disease name shouldn't include geographic locations, people's names, any sort of species, class of animal or food, any culture or population, an industry or occupation, any terms that incite undue fear, and particularly because it um, often wrongly blames either people or a community or a specific animal in ways that are not accurate and also are discriminatory. And what we're seeing recently is that, you know, a lot of racism that has certainly been around and been underlying have been really highlighted with COVID. Kind of early on in the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of targeting of Chinese Americans and of immigrants, Chinese immigrants. So a lot of folks who were boycotting Chinese businesses, Chinese restaurants, um, and even having people in leadership calling it a Chinese virus, right? That there are ways that um, that has been communicated in a more systemic way. And then we've been seeing as the virus unfolds that there are disparities and differences in mortality rates based on, particularly with Black Americans being much more vulnerable to COVID for a number of different factors, and also being having higher mortality rates. So it's impacting communities, Black communities and communities of color disproportionately. Right. And I think one thing I've heard is that, you know, we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats, right? And so, that folks who already did not have a lot of access to resources, who have been marginalized institutionally, and you know, kind of have already been experiencing a lot of discrimination, have been experiencing more that's been amplified even more through this pandemic. There's also been a number of discrimination of African immigrants in China. Um, that there are ways that even in the midst of what's been happening in this pandemic, that there is this anti-Black sentiment that still um, comes up. And I think in the bullet point we don't have here is really a lot of the recent uprisings from police brutality and killings. And the picture on the bottom here contrasts the Michigan State House in two different ways. The one on the left shows the um, folks who were protesting um, the stay-at-home order, right? That there were a bunch of these white men who came armed um, and stormed the state house, and they were met peacefully, and were not were allowed to just be there. And then most recently, at the same state house, protesters who are on the streets are getting tear gassed and um, getting rubber bullets shot at them, right? And so there's both the deaths and the brutality um, that were happening, um, that the protests were responding to, and then ongoing brutality and demonization as the protests have been continuing. So I just want to take a moment now, because I've given a lot of really heavy um, history and talked about a few heavy things, and so I just want to take some space now. You can either pause here, or feel free to write down, what are your thoughts and feelings surrounding this history? What's coming up for you as you hear about this? Um, And then how does this information inform your experience, particularly as a woman of color coping through COVID-19 today? So we're gonna move on to the next slide. If you need more time, just feel free to pause right here, um, but we will continue.
So as Jen said, that we gave you a lot of information on how different infectious diseases over time have been related to, um, unjustifiably related to minority communities. And we also think that it's important that we understand the different levels of racism and xenophobia that we as human beings tend to engage in and also witness and experience. So there are three levels of racism: interpersonal racism, cultural racism, and institutional racism. Interpersonal racism would be something which we either engage in or we experience interpersonally between people. It's more of at a relationship level. For example, experiencing harassment. We have seen instances of people running away from other Asian origin people, or people implicating minority people, saying that they are carrying the virus. That's a form of interpersonal harassment related to racism and coronavirus. Cultural racism is more about social exclusion, mistrust around the virus. So, as you saw in one of the previous slides, we had an image where they wrote, "Thank you for understanding, but we are not accepting any Chinese customers due to coronavirus." That mistrust and social exclusion of the Asian American population is cultural racism, and cultural racism would target and retribute specifically Chinese owned businesses. And we had seen in our own localities, so many Chinese owned businesses were running out of business because people would not want to eat there anymore. So that's a form of cultural racism. Institutional racism is something that we experience in multiple institutions that we live in. It could be education institution, police force as an institution, um, and other institutions could be something that we experience in healthcare, of how people of minority status experience different levels of healthcare and different form of care from their healthcare providers, and stereotypes attached to their own status, on their ethnic status. So institutional racism relates to people experiencing disproportionate mortality rates, occupational segregation, something that we also call as food desert, based on where are different ethnic minorities located, different forms of health insurance, and the rates of health insurance, criminal justice system that we are seeing in our environment currently, and which has always been there, but it's far more intolerable now, and we are far more speaking up against it now. And again, democracy and voting rights, as we have seen over the years, democracy and voting rights were not as inclusive as they are right now, and they were quite discriminatory to begin with, and it has taken decades of movements by minority communities against those discriminatory practices for democracy to be more inclusive. Another form of racism is more overt, in which you would feel that people are harassing other people of ethnic minority very overtly, but then there are some microaggressions, just some stare looks could be something like that, or experiencing microaggression between colleagues who would not say something to you on the face, but subtly you would realize that they would not want to sit in the same area that you are sitting in, thinking if someone is of minority status, they might be carrying the virus. So there are different overt and covert levels of racism. And overt racism today in our society is not as acceptable. That's why we are seeing a lot of microaggressions that are being um, experienced by people of minority communities. Something that's related with racism, but is also different from it, is xenophobia, which is dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. And we see that specifically with coronavirus because it originated in China, but uh, and that gives certain people of America and certain people in power of America to name the virus as Chinese virus, which is a very xenophobic and racist way of looking at things, and not really understanding the whole context behind how the virus originated and how it affects people, and how it doesn't have to do with a community or a country, but it just does have to do with our way of living as human species. So, racism and xenophobia, we can see, have been pretty much highlighted and experienced by a lot of ethnic minority communities during the current times of coronavirus. And people who experience racism and xenophobia because of coronavirus and other reasons, we have been experiencing a lot of things, and it impacts us on so many different levels. We feel isolated and othered because ethnic communities are the minorities in this country, and feeling isolated and othered by so many other people who are not ethnic minorities is a very common feeling. Experiencing pressure to disprove stereotypes could also include we trying to internalize some kind of racism and xenophobia, so that we don't portray that we are one of the other communities and we would want to fit in to the majority community. Stress related to being a representative of our own group and community. When we write out statements in support and in solidarity, it's mostly the people of minority community who have to step up to speak up for their community. And along with all the trauma of being marginalized and discriminated, representing the community itself presents a huge responsibility, which comes with a lot of burden and pressure. There's another feeling of being fearful, feelings of anxiety, feelings of the frustration and helplessness, depression and anger, because this is not something new, as Jen was sharing with everyone. This has been going on for ages. And the fact that we have evolved in so many ways when it comes to technology and other things, but we have not really evolved when it comes to the basic instinct which we tend to follow, which is othering others and blaming others and finding faults with others than self-reflection. It would come with a lot of anger that we would feel that there have been decades and years and centuries of discrimination and things have not really changed at all. So feeling anxious and feeling frustrated and angry and helpless are very valid feelings in these scenarios. Racism and xenophobia also impacts us negatively when it comes to our concentration, how much we are able to concentrate on our work and reach our milestones and reach the deadlines, and go with business as usual with everything that's going on. It can also impact our motivation to do things, our energy. We might feel burnt out. That burnout is not just the physical burnout, it's emotional burnout, it's exhaustion and just feeling of being drained. And as you see, we have one of the examples here how one of the tweets, Aaron says that they don't feel safe wearing a handkerchief or something else that is not clearly a protective mask covering their face to the store because they're a black man and they're living in this world and they want to stay alive, but they also want to stay alive. So coronavirus comes over and above the racism that this country already has perpetuated against Black folks. And over and above that, if they don't wear a mask that clearly seems as protective, it makes them far more susceptible to experiencing more racist attacks on them. So, this has impacted the communities on a large scale for years, and it's impacting them even more now. So again, with all these information, we can take a moment to reflect with our next slide and just think for ourselves or use these as prompts for our own self-reflection and our conversations in our own groups about the ways that we have experienced racism and xenophobia within the specific context of COVID-19 or coronavirus. You can also see how this has added to our pre-existing stress because the minority communities have been experiencing racism and xenophobia as it is. They just experience it more now with the virus. And we might also take some time to reflect how this has impacted how we show up as women of color in larger spaces when necessary. For example, like grocery shopping, while running in the park, how do we show up as women of color? Has it changed how we show up? So I'll just take a pause for a minute here to give you some time to reflect on that before moving on.
Thank you, Ishta. And if you need more time to reflect on this, certainly feel free to pause here. Um, but we'll continue with the slides now. So I guess before kind of going into the skills and resources for coping, I think one thing I want to highlight from what Ishta had shared was that the feelings of being overwhelmed and not being able to concentrate and the kind of the difficulty um, of even just trying to feel not emotionally overwhelmed is completely understandable. That with all of these contextual stressors on top of a pandemic, and on top of all the other stress that you were experiencing before this pandemic started, that all of this is so much to bear. And so part of it is to help you develop compassion for yourselves for feeling this way, because it's completely understandable, because it is a lot of things to be stressed about, and a lot of historical and like chronic experiences too that we're bringing with us. And so, first and foremost, to really build compassion for yourself, and um, kind of what feels like is limiting now, right? That we're just in a different context, and so that means what we're able to do looks different than what it was when we had more emotional resources. But another point I want to bring up is really to take some time, particularly since we are social distancing, to be intentional about building and engaging a social network, and support network, identifying those friends, those mentors or professors, family members, or any other groups or spaces or community that really replenish your resources, that help build you up, um, and trying to think about ways to actively engage in those support networks, particularly since it's harder to just run into people out and about now, or in different, um, like maybe going to church or other places where we would run into or be in contact with our support. That, right now it requires being really intentional and um, reaching out and being creative in what you're doing. And so, um, I want to emphasize that, because I think right now that's really hard to do, and it's so important to do. Another point we want to bring up is trying to build a strong, positive cultural identity and sense of self. Um, I think this is, in some ways, it's easier said than done, because these messages are so immersed, and are often not even completely visible. um all the different racist messages, we may have internalized, or that people around us may have internalized, right? And being able to kind of reflect on that, and think about, where is that coming from? Is that coming from messages about, when someone's telling me they're surprised how well I can, like how articulate I am, right? That it's not about me, or some assumption that I'm not actually smart enough to be able to articulate what I'm saying, but it's about them having these um, assumptions of what it means for a brown person to speak, and how they would speak, and if I'm not articulate, that it also does not say anything negative about me, right? That no one has a script in front of them and can be perfect and on point all the time. And so trying to unlearn those messages and what that means. And part of that is learning about the own history of maybe um, folks in your culture, and ways that, all the different ways they've contributed, and really ground yourself in the history and richness of groups that you're connected to, and really try to participate in spaces that celebrate your cultural norms and ideals, um, because I think we're often in many spaces where it's not celebrated. And so can you be really intentional about finding those spaces, and really um, making time, and putting energy towards that? And I think another piece is that you don't have to do everything alone, right? That not only is there that support network, but you can also activate people in your life that you consider to be allies and accomplices. Um, you don't have to be the one doing all the educating, standing up in every meeting or in every class, right? Find those people who you know can take up that um, mantle, right? So I think it's hard because it feels like I think there's a balance of between wanting to make sure your voice is heard and you don't have to do that emotional labor all the time, right? Someone else can do that who has more resources because they have more privileges. And so trying to recognize that and be compassionate with yourself um, when you make those choices. Another thing is to I mean, get empowered, like that's uh, so simple, but I think getting really involved in social action and social justice, right? Getting kind of doing direct action um, in the ways that you can, right? That can help you both feel connected to community and also um, be a part of the community and fighting against this system of racism that's embedded in our culture. Um, and using different communication strategies to combat the different offensive statements. I think if you choose to kind of uh, uh, confront someone who is saying offensive things, I think, well, one, you can make a choice on what feels um, right in that moment in terms of safety and your goal of that moment. And if you choose to confront them, to be thinking about, well, maybe I can use some Socratic questioning and ask them back. Like if they say that they're surprised at how well I'm able to speak, you can reflect back, well, how did you expect me? Why would you expect me to not be articulate? Right? Kind of bringing it back to them so then they have to realize um, their own bias, right? Rather than you having to explain it or have to talk through like what their intent may have been. And then reframing negative situations and challenge negative self-talk or thoughts. So identifying um, what feelings you have and particularly if you're being critical about yourself or judgmental, um, really trying to highlight that how you feel is valid and and that particularly with some of the self-talk that you're not expected to be perfect, like this that there is, if you can imagine how you would respond to a friend, I think it's easier for us to be more compassionate when thinking about how we would respond to a friend going through this situation than we are about ourselves. And can you kind of practice recognizing, um, I'm having thought I'm just being too sensitive, or I'm being dramatic, right? But no, like this is actually happening and it didn't feel right. And, it's okay that I'm upset about it. And I think also really engaging in self-care. So really kind of taking the time to take care of your physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental well-being um, in the different ways that um, might be that might work for you, and that looks different for different people. And taking time to figure out what exactly are those things that really feel like they replenish your resources, and intentionally engaging in them regularly. And the last piece that I think is really important is to really limit the exposure to really triggering situations, um, particularly on the news and social media. I think with with every instance of police brutality that uh, with so much access to being able to record things, that we don't need to actually witness the death of someone to know that their life was important, right? And so, like, what does watching those videos add for you? It, I think, just kind of maybe triggering more pain and taking more from your resources that you could be using to engage in more direct action in other ways, or to, you know, get through your day. And I think it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It's just, again, there are things that you can consume in the media that you can know what's happening without getting consumed by the emotional um, impact and burden of that. And so trying to be intentional of what that is and what that looks like.
And as we are reaching towards the end of this webinar, it's important for us to realize what's the intention that we want to set for ourselves. And before we ask ourselves this question, I think this quote from Angela Davis really comes true in the current times. And Angela Davis says that you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And I would just add it, that's exhausting. That's exhausting, but uh, we are not even bound to abandon this responsibility. But it's important that we take care of ourselves while we act to radically transform the world all the time. So it's important, after all this information that we have provided, and the importance of caring for ourselves and coping with the stress related to racism and xenophobia during these times, that we ask you, and you can take some time to reflect, what is that one thing from this particular workshop that you particularly thought appealed to you and that you would like to incorporate into your daily life. And maybe you can take one of those things and just put a check mark next to it for every day once you complete that thing, and see if it's making any difference. Maybe if it's sleeping more, or talking to a friend, or just telling yourself how wonderful you are.
Yeah, thank you, Ishta. And I think, again, as with many of the reflections, if you need more time to just pause this so you have the question slide up as you're writing or reflecting or discussing. But we do want to wrap things up, so we'll continue to the next slide. Um, and these are just additional resources for more information around coping with racism, how to disrupt and address microaggressions and xenophobia. Um, from the counseling center side of it, we have a number of different webinar topics. So for the Women of Color Coping Circle, we're going to have 3 more videos on topics on working from home wellness, relationships revisited and reignited, and then uncharted territory, grieving the uncertain and unknown. And for any other information or events, please go to the Counseling Center website at counseling.umbc.edu/webinar, or go to the My UMBC page. And then we also have social media accounts that you can follow. We have some information that gets updated on there, and that's at UMBC Counseling on Facebook and Instagram. Okay, and then here are just some um, additional webinars that we've done in the past and resources that are available from the Counseling Center. Okay, well, thank you all for taking the time to watch the video and to reflect with us.
Thank you so much for watching the video, and we hope that some of the information that we provided would have proved useful, and it would lead to some healthy discussion among your groups.
Yeah, thank you. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions.